Hello and welcome. I invite you to just notice where you're at, just take hold of what you're doing. Notice what time of day it is for you. Are you listening to this video early in the morning, the evening, maybe late at night? Are you cooking? Are you out on a walk? Or maybe you're seated down in a chair at your laptop. Just take note of where you are in this moment. And I invite you to tune into your presence with a breath. So maybe just starting with a nice exhalation out the mouth. And then allowing the inhale to come naturally through the tip of the nose. And again, just a really big embodied breath out. So today we're going to be speaking about synchronicity as well as transference. And as we pull these themes together, I hope that you see how special each moment is as we call forth the principle of synchronicity that is so ever present in our life. It is very much a knowing field. It is very much associated with the triple burner or the fascia or connective tissue. And it's very much like a spider web that connects all beings through consciousness. So today we're going to take a look at that spider web and do a quick little review of where we've been. So if you recall, last week we looked at the self and how the self is actually quite a big container, as well as myth and the importance of myth in being a good dream analysis for ourselves and being able to read our own personal psychic insights and messages often are enhanced by our ability to be familiar with myth and story across all culture. And so we take this understanding of self as a container and myth as a teacher, and then we're going to apply it to how it relates to the principles of alchemy. And talk about transference and countertransference, not just in a therapeutic setting, but in a life setting. We often can transfer energy to partners or loved ones, or we can feel someone else's countertransference, which is our response to that. And we'll also talk what Carl Jung coined as the wounded healer. And that's something that maybe you've heard before just in healing circles or spiritual conversations, that when we go through something difficult, we often glean those experiences and understand from a first-hand perspective, what it's like to go through a certain type of suffering. And when you make it on the other side, you're better available, you're more equipped to also help other people through the white waters, the difficult rafts and moments of time in someone else's life. And so that is called the wounded healer. And then we'll look at the concept of synchronicity, or the universe speaking to us, and how things that occur in sequence or order are often messages from the internal psyche that are getting projected outward into the world. And then our last activity will conclude with just a recap on some active imagination tools and skills as you go forward. So this particular recording will bring the intellectual piece of Jungian psychology to a close. And of course, there's so much more from an experiential lens that we can add on and apply to our daily living. But really, the intention of the course has been to develop that emotional literacy and self-study. So being able to identify and name, wow, I'm, exploring my personal shadow, or wow, I'm in the collective shadow, or this is a complex for me of something that's psychically charged, that's undigested, or being able to notice, this myth is one of, the 12 archetypes that Carl Jung speaks of. And this myth is alive for me right now. So just building this repertoire of language to be able to name our experience so that as we move in the world, we move with clarity. And as we move with clarity, we're better equipped to align to our values. And we can't obtain alignment in life or have a good center point if we don't know what we're aligning to. So, hopefully, this course is giving you some tools, some literacy, some nomenclature just to explain and to archive your inner world. So, taking this transition from a winter dream course and springing into action. So let's jump in. So, as we know, the self is not just a structure in the psyche, but rather it is the container of the psyche, which is ever fluid and changing, but remains in its continuity as a means of organization. And that's from Warren Coleman. And then the inner personality is different than the self in that it's the behavior to one's inner psychic process, as well as the attitudes we carry. And often these attitudes is a face that's turned inward towards the unconscious. So again, personality, according to Carl Jung and psychodynamic theory, is something that is changeable. And in Buddhist psychology, once you become someone, once you have a personality, what we do is we dissolve that. And that is called, if you remember, Ouroboros, or the snake eating its own tail. And so once the snake realizes that it is a snake, it has a personality and identity, the only thing to do next is to dissolve into collective unconscious, to dissolve into the mandala of being a human that's part of a larger ecosystem, a larger humanity. And so we enter in this place where it becomes very difficult to judge other people or to not act with compassion and love, because you see that all of humanity is simply an extension of you. And how can you not extend compassion, love, curiosity to self? Because there is this connection to all beings through the collective unconscious, and the self is the container for that. So as we go forward, just setting the self as this big container, this big jug, and then myth is something that we tune into when we're looking to see what archetypes are most present that are getting expressed in persona, ego, or self. And the self just helps us mediate the stories that have come before us and where we situate ourselves in reality. So, alchemy. I know, isn't this so fun? We're talking about alchemy. So, this was actually a really big thing for Carl Jung. And in a lot of his later writings, he talks about alchemy from the 14th and 17th century as being a big source of inspiration for him in changing and alchemizing personality through emotion, through emotional awareness. So, there's this idea that the universe vibrates and our thoughts vibrate. Where thought goes, energy follows. So, as we're getting ready to talk about themes of the wounded healer, and I think many of us in this class, in this moment, can attest that we've been through hard things in life. Life gives us a natural arc of suffering because it is part of the human condition. So maybe it's the suffering of birthing a child, or the months that follow where you don't sleep very well or at all. Or maybe it is the life cycle of death and rebirth, losing a pet or a loved one that's no longer in physical form. So life always has these moments for us to step into a courageous warrior and survive the suffering, to endure and come out stronger on the other side. With that being said, we always have agency around our thoughts. And where thought goes, energy follows. So, this is that piece of alchemy that we exchange energy with people. And by energy, I mean it in the most scientific way of photons. We can measure decibels of volumes in voice, right? When we shout, that is an energetic exchange, whether it's shouting excitement for your team winning or your kiddos playing sports, or shouting anger, right? That's a transference. Or if it's closing your eyes and sending someone good thoughts or wishing them well for their day ahead, or sending someone I love you just via text, right? That is still an energy exchange where our thoughts are creating vibration and then energy follows that flow. So again, just noticing what programming is around you. And that's why in television, it originally is called programming. So are you taking in a TV show or a movie of fear and you experience your world as being a fearful place? Or are you sitting in a program of creativity, excitement, possibility? So again, just paying attention as part of this study of alchemy to really noticing what comprises your reality, and what movie or what show would you like to see if you were the main character. So we're going to talk about this as an alchemical process. So alchemy had two intentional aims in the 14th through 17th century, and they were often more chemical in nature. So to find base elements and then turn philosopher's stone, so turn stone into gold. And so it was to convert base matter into spirit by helping the soul become free from materialism. So let's just take that in. And we don't have to make it a polarity that you're either spiritual or you're materialistic, but rather it's being free from it. So not being tied down or attached to material pursuits. And those material pursuits might be pursuits of degrees, or those pursuits might be pursuit of a big house or a big life. And so instead of being tied down by that, accepting it for as it is, but not being attached. And so converting base matter into spirit, helping free the soul. And then the other aim of alchemy is conjectivo, which is an alchemical symbol that can sometimes symbolize sexual intercourse or intermingling of two personalities. And so, how we apply it to therapy and just to life is that there always is an exchange of energy, like we talked about. Are you sending someone an I love you, which is an energetic exchange of energy that moves through the vocal cord and creates sound? Or are you sending someone a really harsh energy as far as transference goes? All right. So now that we've covered this more large scale view of transference through words, through sound, through intention, and this notion of alchemy, let's look at the wounded healer. So Jung thought that alchemy, if regarded metaphorically, was a precursor of the modern study of the unconscious and really became this therapeutic concern that he applied to transforming his own personality from stone or the hard places like the shadow into gold. And so during the Middle Ages, alchemy was really understood for medicinal properties, scientific properties, and it was often associated with the color wheel, or being able to transmute color pigments and inks to a broader source for markets. So it really is kind of a modern chemistry, but it was also used in art and textiles and created a big wave of creative expression when it came about as a form of study. It was closely tied to art, is also important to note. So this term, the wounded healer, really comes from this time period, and it comes from a legend of a Greek doctor who recognized all of these wounds he had, all of these crazy tendencies he had for extremes, for deep emotional spells, for body joint pain. And so, what he did was he established a sanctuary in ancient Greece where other people could come and heal their wounds. So, he understood just how difficult it was. So, he created a center where other people could come. So let's talk about this ancient center and the practice of the wounded healer. But before we get there, I want to expand a little bit more this concept of the wounded healer as a very kind of scientific, complex topic that Jung spent a lot of time on. So it's not as simple as you experience something painful so you can help others. Rather, he believed that there were these levels of transference and counter-transference that were always transpiring. So there's another Jungian scholar since that has written all of this incredible work on the complexity of energetic transference. And his name is Andrew Samuels. And so Andrew says that there's actually 5 points of tension. And this chart that you see here is from Carl Jung, but he talks about it. He says that there's tension that we consider everything in the universe and every interaction we have with someone transference and countertransference, or this idea that perhaps we're just responding in the world to energy we're feeling. So one thing is everything counter-transference or transference. The second, he says, is that perhaps we're responding unconsciously to someone else's presence of archetypal information. And so he says the discussion on this point becomes very theological. Transference must be personal in the sense that only personal expressions of the inner world's content are possible. And so, are we responding to archetypes in the unconscious based on a person, knowingly or unknowingly? So this is another great conundrum or point of tension that he's putting in is, are we responding to someone else's archetypes? So someone might be working with the archetype of a gesture, and so they're very silly. So even before anything comes out of their mouth, you find yourself laughing and being jovial with them because of the transference you're receiving. So maybe you project back jovial energy back, and then it's a good transference. Perhaps somebody is working with the archetype of the hero or legacy, and so you see them as heroic, and so you put them on a pedestal. And maybe that's not a helpful type of transference, but because you see that archetype, that's how you interface with them. So that's another piece of this transference is, are we responding to someone else's primary archetypes? The second, he says, is there tension with transference? Perhaps transference is more about being a highway for our development. So we experience the energy other people put onto us and we decipher if that energy feels good. So instead of conforming to the energy we're getting, we decide to take our own path. So an example of that might be somebody who grows up in the United States, which is a very gendered culture, right? We have female bathrooms, male bathrooms. From young ages, we tell little kids, you're a good girl, right? And I'm sure you've heard, boys don't cry. And we know those are simply stereotypes, but people can go through their whole lives really attaching to this energetic transference of how to be in the world. And so taking your own stance and saying, hey, actually, I don't identify as a woman. I identify this way. Or, hey, I don't have heterosexual preferences like, my parents told me or my religion told me I do. My preferences are another way. So we practice individuation, which takes a lot of work. So it's noticing the story of transference and socializations energetically that we've had our whole life and deciding to individuate or do something different. So Andrew Samuel says this is another aspect of energetic transference. And the fourth that he claims is that there can be cultural and political aspects to transference on the human psyche. Wow. Wow. So, how do we deal with political transference of ideas? So, we can see that while we're talking about this as a very simple concept, it actually has a lot more dimensions when we're looking at the wounded healer. So, the idea is that a therapeutic setting or a healing setting requires a lot of self-awareness to claim and to notice what energy or thought patterns are yours or your wounds and what belongs to the other person. So anytime we're in relationship, this applies. Are we projecting things onto our partner that are not true? Or are we standing in a neutral stance and just noticing someone else's projections? So, as we think about this, let's talk about the wounded healer. So, it was in ancient Greece a beautiful gift, the most pristine gift to have this designation as a wounded healer because it meant that you had suffered deeply and made it through to the other side. This is also a concept that you hear a lot about in shamanic ritual and healing, where only those who have suffered greatly or been through extreme measures that test the soul, the hero's journey, are afforded with the ability to help others. So, wounded healers are people whose painful experiences enable them to help others. They're often good listeners, empathic, accepting, and very resourceful. They view all experiences as opportunities, and they can be within a traditional role like a psychologist, a social worker, a counselor, but they can also exist outside of professional helping relationships. It might be someone who's a dance teacher or an artist or on a board of a nonprofit, right? So there's these different ways that we can put into practice our empathy and our listening skills. But where this tradition comes from is actually the process of incubation. So in this sacred temple, they would have you lie down on stone tabs and do purifying rituals for the soul as well as the body. So if the body was uncontaminated and the soul was free to commune with the gods, there would be a preliminary sacrificial offering, often whatever medical issue or pain you were encompassing. And so, kind of in modern day terms, we would say lay on a couch, but these were often stone tablets and they would go to sleep. And if they were lucky and they had a healing dream, they could report it back and say what type of healing they would do going forward. Maybe they were a sound healer, or maybe they were an herbalist. And if they were lucky, the initiate would be bitten by a snake. Some of you guys are like, I'm not signing up for that. When I first moved to Boulder, I have an animal deck of cards that I work with spiritually. And I drew, when I got here, the snake and the prairie dog. And we went on this hike, and it's called Hogsback. And guess what? There were dozens of prairie dogs everywhere. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. My spirit animals are coming to greet me. And then on this long hike, as you do when you're hiking on long trails, I pull off the hiking trail to urinate. And so as I'm peeing, all of a sudden I see a rattlesnake, a baby one, hiss up. And yes, it almost bit me in a place that would be very awkward if you went to the ER to get treated. And it didn't, but it was this profound moment of, whoa, the initiation, going through a new phase, moving somewhere. And so I tell this story because in life, we have to remember that, while we may not be invited to an ancient temple or laid out on a slab stone, life will give us these initiation moments where we feel like there's a big transformation taking hold. It might be moving jobs, moving homes. It might be changing jobs, or starting new jobs. It might be having kids. It might be losing children, right? That's hard to have loss of a child. So we're always going through these rites of passage, whether they're really big or small. So moving from winter to summer. And so, as we look at this archetype of the wounded healer, it's important that we know that when we're in a helping role, we are also helping energetically. And so, what we're taking in from others and what we're putting out operates on a vibrational level that can be measured um, through MRI machines, and it absolutely can be measured through physics via photons. So these are real principles we're playing with as we step into this alchemical process that incorporates transference and countertransference as holding and claiming the space of being a healer or being someone embodied who knows what it's like to suffer and then to help others via compassion. So this is the Greek temple I was talking about. Um, Extra credit if you can say it. It's Ashli Puko. And so with it, these are some of the stone tabs and some of the early history of medicine. And in the early history of medicine, before this big separation of church and state, traditional healing arts and hard science, there definitely was this union where spiritual practices and medicine went hand in hand. So going forward, I invite you to just kind of sit with, where in your life have you experienced suffering? Where in your story do you find that you can help heal others by holding a stance of compassion and curiosity? So that is the shrine and the early cults of Apollo that existed in the 6th century BC. And some of these principal monuments were the earliest sites of temples and hospital buildings that were devoted to healing gods in Greek and Roman times. So if you just want to know where that image is coming from. Some important things to note about the path of shadow work, the path of suffering, is that healing can take place only if the analyst has an ongoing relationship with their own unconscious, right? Like if you're not doing self-study, if you're not checking in on what deep things you're working on, what belongs to you, then it becomes impossible to stay aligned to help others. And what can happen is an inflated sense of self where you over identify with the healer archetype, which is a form of inflation, where it's like, oh, I can heal you, right? Oh, I can fix you. And any type of grounded, aligned healer knows that there's no fixing someone else. Someone else knows best. Advice is the worst thing we can give anyone because it minimizes their ability to listen to their own innate wisdom. It minimizes the ability to tune into one's own intuition or teacher or higher self. And so, again, the best gifts we can give are compassion and curiosity versus advice or stepping into an inflated role of I can fix or I can heal. And then the other piece of depth psychology, and this is for those of us who hold a more professional role taking the class, is it can be a dangerous profession since the analysis is prone to always being infected by the other's wounds or having his or her wounds reopened. And from like the most medical perspective, it's like, yeah, you know, as an acupuncturist, there's a ton of stuff I can do for flu and cold season for folks. They'll come in, get points along their nasal canals. I run the risk of getting sick, right? So I have to be extra careful that I'm drinking ginger tea, eating a healthy diet, sleeping well. And the same is true emotionally. Last year, I was asked to do a court case on sexual trauma for a young child. And while I'm, you know, writing and compiling all of these abuse statistics of children and looking at the DSM codes and writing down some of the physical manifestation of what happens to a human body that has experienced that lack of agency. Um, Things like enuresis, bedwetting, or sweating, or inability to control bladder function during the day or at night. Like, it brought me to tears, and it was like, oh yeah. So it opens up my own wounds, and it's okay to sit with our shadow, but we can't live there, right? We can't do intense, deep emotional surgery all the time. So again, it's noticing, where are your personal wounds? Maybe it's sexual trauma, like me, or maybe it's something else, like really difficult parenting situations, or emotional incest with parents, or enmeshment, and just knowing that someone else's story isn't worse or better, but it's just your story. So in this work, we also have to go real gentle on taking care of ourselves, and real gentle on naming and noticing what our wounds are, so that we're not overly sensitive or defensive when walking in hard places. Okay, so this takes us to our next piece, which is synchronicity. Yeah, I'm so excited about this. So in the shamanic course I teach in the fall, there's a whole book on this really excellent poet, and his name is slipping me right now, but he talks a lot about how synchronicity is his spiritual practice. It's spending a lot of time noticing the symbols of his world and paying really special attention to colors and sounds and connections and notes, and just even, walking on a train station or a busy subway, just noticing what words or phrases you hear, and that being part of your inner reality being reflected outer, and just being able to interpret messages from the large consciousness. So let's jump in. I have a picture on this slide of traveling. And I think I picked it because I realized that, because I've been moving so much in the past few years, that when you move, it becomes a little more difficult for me, want to travel because I'm still trying to ground. But I'm finally feeling, for the first time in a long time, that I'm calling forth the ability to travel. So like somewhere sunny and warm, like maybe the cenotes, or underground Mayan temples in Mexico. So I'm putting that out there. If anyone wants to travel, let me know. Let's put our let's click our heads together, and maybe we can do a retreat, or if nothing else, just go hang out on a beach and do some yoga and meditate. So synchronicity, what are you calling forth? What is your story? So let's start with a little Q&A. What is the power of synchronicity? And what is the difference between intuition and synchronicity? And then I'm going to pull forward some quotes from Carl Jung the Great. And yeah, I think really, in my book at least, is so great because of his level of self-study. That is somebody that is constantly journaling, doing art, drawing, and really in this place of studying the self. And now we know how complex the self is, right? The self isn't just like, oh, I'm a female, or oh, I do psychology, or oh, no, that's all ego or persona, what we project into the world. What are you really? Whew, that's a big one. Whew, self. Self is a big thing. It holds myths. It holds shadow. It holds your ancestral story. So the self is a lot. So it makes sense that it requires ample space to study oneself, because according to Carl Jung, self was big. So synchronicity was a check-in for kind of like what is going on in your inner world. So the power of synchronicity often link us to an underlying order in the universe that is profoundly reassuring. It can open us up to mystery, delight, and give us a sense that we're being taken care of. It can also nudge us to grow in some ways that can feel a little scary, but are affirmed by life's directions. So an example of this might be I am starting a new path and reading the signs. Are they telling me yes or no? Am I hitting a bunch of red lights? Do I need to reassess, or do things feel like a green? When my grandpa was dying, he had one of the most beautiful deaths I had ever witnessed. Before he died, he gave everything away. So he literally died with a very small little dresser, like a side table, and then a rack of 5 shirts. And while he was passing away, his muscle tissue was almost non existent, and it was literally just skin and bones. And I would hug him and just feel his bones. And even with that, just being left to bones, he exuded so much love. And so he had been, like most people do, it's a process to die. So he took many weeks as he was passing. And I can remember deciding to go to work on a Sunday afternoon. And I was real hesitant to go because he hadn't been doing well, but I went. And I got the text from my mom being like, he's passing, come home. So I immediately left work, and I remember thinking, I hope I do not get any red lights on this long stretch from the university home, because on the street, kind of like Lead and Cold, it's all of these lights. And I can remember turning the corner and being like, if I have a red light and it's safe, I'm totally going to run it. And that trip, which had never happened, I hit every single green light. The power of synchronicity. That's just a small example of when we need it, the world gives us a green light. It gives us a yes, a go, without us having to try so hard. So, other question might be, well, what is the difference between intuition and synchronicity? So, here's a description. Intuition is powerful for living one's life and flow. Intuition for me is it a yes or no? And intuition is very somatic. It's very somatic. So, in coaching work, we do emotional literacy, which is what this course is. How do you talk about the world, your psyche? How do you talk about feelings? And we also do embodiment work and spiritual growth. But that embodiment work is knowing how your body says yes. When my body says yes, it's my palms are open, I'm often relaxed, I can take a deep breath. If I'm hesitant, that's often a no for me, or if my breath is shallow. So intuition is just your sense of living in life's flow, where synchronicity is more about guideposts that are a call towards not just coincidences, um, but rather direction posts. So I think of synchronicity as your guidepost, your green light, your red light, and intuition is just moving through life's flow on the day to day as to what is true for you or not. Hopefully that's helpful. And so it has been called this, all of these guideposts, all of these signposts have been called in many fields, especially not hermeneutics, which is like another philosophy of self-study and a research methods, for any dissertation folks out there, or scholars. But hermetics is more about the principle of things like mentalism or awareness of as above, so below, or other correspondence, that everything is connected. And so the knowing field is another way. If you recall in earlier classes or lectures, Carl Jung spoke about the psychic stratum, or this repository, kind of like the matrix, where there's all of this limitless data we can access that operates outside of time. And so within that, we can get fields and signposts that we call synchronicity. But according to this framework, there are already things that we've set in motion in this life or in other lifetimes, if we're taking a Buddhist framework. So he says, because the eyes gaze, but can catch no glimpse of it, and it is the knowing field, the collective energy, the all. It is called elusive. Because the ear listens but cannot hear, it is called rarefied. Because the hands feel for it but cannot find it, it is infinitesimal. These are called the shapeless shapes, the forms without form. Whew, the forms without form, the shapeless shape. Wow. Go towards them and you can see no front. Go after them and you can see no rear. So, this to me, in hearing him talk about what synchronicity is and this larger field of psychic stratum or knowing field or collective unconscious, is very elusive. It kind of is like if you have a meditation practice and you're really deep on your breath where you're like, oh, I'm inhaling and it's so long and deep and full and my mind is empty. And then you exhale. The moment you notice that you're meditating, you fall out of it because you had the thought of like, oh, I'm doing it. Or when like you're first learning how to ride a bike and it's like, I'm doing it. And then you fall over. So the moment you go to grasp it, it's already gone because it requires that you're fully in the present moment. And being present means your mind isn't jotting to the future, it's not calling in the past. So I see this as very much a Buddhist interpretation of presence, is the knowing field. He also describes why it's very hard for folks that are trained in a Western mindset, a European mindset of science being this dichotomy from spirituality. And if research tools and measurements can't quantify it, then throw it out. And so he says, we must remember that the rationalist attitude of the West is not the only possible one and is not all embracing, but is in many ways prejudice and bias, and that ought to be corrected. So he's just reminding us that in the West, and this is even in the early 1900s, he's calling out the systems that be of, hey, this is a very rationalist attitude. You think you know best. There are other ways of seeing the world, like the kaleidoscope we chatted about last week. Can you see the world in a colorful, different way than the person next to you, even though you're seeing the exact same thing? Yep, you bet you can. So he also goes on to say, natural laws are statistical truth, which means they're only valid when dealing with macro physical quantities. In the realm of very small quantities, prediction becomes uncertain, if not impossible, because very small quantities no longer behave in accordance with known natural laws. So again, it's all about perspective. If you were an ant in my kitchen or in my classroom, your view of the world is going to be that kitchen or that classroom. But perhaps if you take the consciousness of an ant and place it in an eagle, you're going to have a very different perspective, perhaps of my kitchen being part of a larger neighborhood, a larger map, a bigger city. And same with a classroom. You'll see a lot more students coming in and out. So our perspective, whether it's small or big, really changes how we understand natural law. So again, I just want to put that out there that Jung is challenging the rational attitude and mind. And in part, that is why he was so influential for the Beatles, right? He was on the cover of the Lonely Hearts Club, and why Rolling Stones were reading about him. So this is very important to challenge that very rational perspective. Is it important? Yes, of course, right? With science, we're not just gonna only use intuition and go forward to make big policy or health decisions. We want to use multiple data points, which takes me to kind of our closing theme, which is the inner reality mirrors the outer. So this is an axiom of truth in hermeneutics, and is this notion, this really deep notion that so much of how we construct the world is happening in the mind, and that things happen within and around you because of your personal mental state and how your mind perceives it. An example might be, how do you see a table? One viewer might say, oh, I love the color of this table. Someone else might be like, oh, it's too small, or it's too chunky. Or someone else might love the shape of it because they've been looking for one just in their kitchen. So same table, but you can see how the perspectives were vastly different. So with this, it's important to know that where we spend time in our consciousness, the thoughts we tell ourselves absolutely impact the outer world. So I don't want to take an extreme stance on this because it's important, because now we're getting into more philosophical terrain of free will versus fate, or nature versus nurture. And let me just say it's both in my perspective, right? Balance, it's both. Do you cause harm to come your way? No, of course not. Sometimes that just happens. But I will say that the more you focus on what it is that you want to happen, or the more you focus on the outcome, the more you pull that towards you. And so they've done a lot of studies with high performance athletes, and they found an ingredient that athletes who tend to visualize themselves winning or making the basketball shot actually perform better than those that don't take time to visualize the outcomes that they want to see in the world. So again, life is a co-creation. So there may be things that are put in your way that are difficult, and there will always be some level of suffering according to a Buddhist philosophy. And the intention is to notice it, but also turn and say, what in the outer world would I like to cultivate on the inner world, and spending more time there. So the tools of how we spend more time in this cultivating this beautiful inner garden within us is active imagination, letting the mind create, letting the mind dance. So I have a few pictures here from ceremonial dance and ritual that takes place often in springtime. And so as we're moving into spring, really thinking, what am I anchoring? What do I want to see in the world? And then becoming that, spending time with that. So some examples of active imagination are automatic writing, artistic activities like dance, music, painting, sculpting, ceramics, craft. And so if you're more clinically oriented, we would say, how can the patient make him, herself, themselves creatively independent through this method? By painting, one gives shape to himself. Pretty cool stuff. So in 1913 and 16, active imagination was a meditation technique that Jung used. He would take the contents of the unconscious and translate it into images, narratives, stories as separate entities, and allowed it to serve as a bridge between conscious mind and unconscious. So this is huge, right? And I just want to name that it's a separate entity. So an image and narrative is separate than you are. And that is so important linguistically to say, and I just am laughing right now because I tell myself this all the time. It's like, I'm not crazy. I'm just in a crazy situation, right? Brene Brown, who's a social worker who does a lot of research, she talks about how her daughter went to kindergarten and her teacher told her daughter, oh my gosh, you were so messy, because she had paint all over her hands, all over her, her desk, I'm sure the floor. You're so messy. And her daughter looked at her teacher and said, I am not messy. I'm just in a messy state. So again, just kind of notice, right? We are a reflection of the macro. We live in a very imbalanced culture, right? Where there are people who have millions and billions of dollars without actively working, and people who are working 80 hours or working without documentation or basic living rights who aren't making enough money to live. And we are at late stage capitalism where there's been such an imbalance of shadow and such an imbalance of greed and yang that we are in a system that is crazy making. Setting aside any individual or family trauma, just looking around at our world. And so it's important to give ourselves that compassion and that softness of, wow, I'm in a crazy making situation. I'm not crazy. And so distinguishing our story as a separate entity. So it might be like, oh, I'm in a story of changing jobs, or I'm in a narrative of a life shift. And that isn't you, and we don't have to personify it as us, but taking it through active imagination and putting it outside of ourselves. This also just is huge for physical development. We know that in kids, active imagination boosts physical development in early years of childhood. Um, I did some research in the past on early childhood developmental markers in elementary school. And in addition to learning alphabets and being able to count numbers, body awareness is on that checklist of how children progress. And so you're better able to cope emotionally if you have faster gross and fine motor skills that kids can use in different games. So even a pretend play helps children create self-awareness around motor movements. And when we look at emotional coding in the body, especially related to trauma, when you're surprised, what happens? A movement, your facial expressions, the frontalis muscle lifts your eyebrows up and your eyes get bigger, right? When you're angry, what happens? Around the glabella, your brows furrow in and you have two lines. When you're happy, your cheeks lift, you smile, you can see the jawline, you can see the teeth. So motor movement and awareness is huge in creating a sense of alignment within us, and even being able to practice this active, fluid imagination of putting out into the world what it is we want to see. And that is very much supporting a more synchronistic life where we're able to read messages from the universe. So the activity for this week is make a dance. Express how you feel through movement. And it doesn't even have to be like a formal like TikTok, a TikTok video. Should we make a TikTok video for our online class? I'm not sure how we would do it. I guess I could send out a Zoom link and we could all collectively dance. I'm just spitballing ideas. I don't know if they'll stick. Some other ideas might be take time to journal, and I journal as much as I can. It's such a big piece of my spiritual practice and keeping my mental health sane. And then, of course, meditating and just noticing any images that hit the psyche when you sit down to meditate, any images that hit the psyche after you're done meditating. But you may also want to make of things, make a list of things you wish to see in the outer world and spend time imagining them in your inner world, just like professional athletes do. What is it that you want to see transpire? All right, so this is a review of the class today. We spoke about the self as a container and the value of understanding myth, like Ouroboros or the snake eating itself. And we talked about transference and countertransference as it relates to alchemy and holding the archetype of the wounded healer, and just noticing that transference and countertransference isn't something that just happens in a therapeutic setting, but it also happens with people that we're close with. So we might get a transference from our mother and then we counter something back. And so being aware that you get to choose what energy you toss back to someone. Maybe someone tosses fear at you and you notice it and you don't take it in, but you set it aside. And instead, you're like, I'm actually secure. I'm going to toss back security at you because I feel safe. Or someone tosses at you being rushed as an energetic transference. Hurry up. And you're feeling like you don't need to rush and you're feeling grounded and slow. So maybe you toss back, hey, you go ahead. You don't have to wait for me. So just noticing how we are always in these energetic soups in our culture, in our family, with our loved ones, with our partners. So just notice what it is you're putting out and notice what comes back to you. We also discussed synchronicity as a way to read the signposts in the universe and talked about how synchronicity still holds space for free will as well as fate. It's a dance. But the more we're able to actively choose and spend time in a world that we'd like to cultivate, the more those experiences come our way. Does that mean we will never suffer ever again? No, because it's part of being a human. Oh my goodness, right? If there's one thing that connects us, it's compassion and suffering. Everybody knows those things. So, synchronicity and active imagination isn't a way to ameliorate pain. Rather, it's just a way to cultivate a life that has more pleasure and presence in it. And then active imagination is one of many tools where we cultivate an inner world that we want to see on the outer world. So, this will conclude our journey of looking at Carl Jung's theories and looking at how to apply them in our dream world and our dreamscape. On this week's handout, I will place some terms from Whitman and Pereira's book on looking at dream sequencing and timing, as well as a deeper exploration of how to work with some myth. So if you're interested and you have been following along with the book, I know some of you have, some of you haven't. Whatever works for you is great. But if you want to read that chapter and kind of find some examples or notes, it's there for you. So going forward, my intentions for you is that this class has allowed you more emotional literacy, as well as more capacity to cultivate a beautiful, astounding inner world, an inner garden that is filled with non-material value and filled with inner peace, so that as you move through the world, that is what you anchor, and that is what you hold in yourself, and that is what you put out energetically in the world. So again, I just hold each and every one of you in highest esteem. And please know that if you're in this course, I absolutely see you as a teacher and a guru. And I just take a big bow to your growth and all that you've lived through, and a big bow to this present moment of acknowledging your inner beauty and your inner garden. So with my hands at my heart and with my head folded down, I take a big breath in and a full breath out and just bow to you and your greatness and gratitude and say thank you for being my teacher. Thank you for walking this path of inner self-study with me. And I look forward to seeing you on the mat or seeing you on the acupuncture table or online in the coaching realm. So have a beautiful rest of your day or your week, sending you big love and can't wait to connect. Until next time.